Hello and welcome back to our third video of the season, which is looking at files. And so you may think that you are file experts now, but there's still a little ways to go. There's still a little bit more information that you need. And today's lesson is really about looking at text files in a slightly different way. And the title is formatted files, and it's specifically text files. And so what you're doing is, instead of just saving an essay, formatted text files means that the information that you are storing is going to follow a particular format. And when you have data that follows a particular format, it turns out that there are techniques that you can use to speed the way that you read that information in. Because if you know that your information is going to be an integer followed by an integer followed by 4 characters, and you're going to have many of those, then you have a pattern that you can follow for being able to read the file, or in some cases being able to skip to particular lines in the file to get the information that you need. So that's sort of the reason that we want to do formatting, but I want to give you a clear idea. And when you think about formatting, the first thing that comes to mind should be something like Excel. Excel was built for formatting data. And so if you think about an example we've talked about in the past, accounts. So if you look at an account, what sort of formatted data might be associated with a bank account? Well, we might have an account number. We might have a last name of the person associated. We might have a first name. We might have a balance associated with it. We might have a date for when the account was opened. And we may have some other information. This information is all formatted. It's going to have a certain pattern to it. An account number is really just an integer. Last name we can think of as a string. First name we can think of as a string. Balance we could think of as a double in Java, or perhaps a float or some other type of format. And then the date operation we could either use as a date object, or we could store it as a string, or even as an integer. So a lot of different possibilities here. You know how to represent this in the computer fairly easy enough. You know about variables, you know about arrays, you can create this. If you think about it, we've also learned how to create this as a class, creating a class to represent an account and having a variable to represent each of these. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to find a way to represent this information in a file. And we're trying to do it in such a way that we can easily tell what piece of information we are looking at. And so, I mean, naively, what you might do is you just may put one line per piece of information, account number, and then last name, and then first name, and just kind of have a really long flowing thing. And that is a possible way of doing it. But there are other ways that we can also explore, and that's what we're going to go over a little bit in this lesson today. So first, a bit of terminology. The individual lines that make up sort of one account in our example, these things are called records. And so if you think of each unique account being a different record, and each of the individual pieces, the columns here, these things are called fields. So we've got records going this way and fields going this way. And so to just give you an example of some data, and a date. Perfect. So this would be an example, and you can imagine that there would be multiple of these going through here. And so the question is, how do we store this in a file? And it turns out that there are 2 ways to go about doing this. One of those ways is called fixed length. And what you do in a fixed length situation is you are going to take the information here and you are going to give each field a fixed length. So what that means is that this account number is not going to be a variable size, but it's going to be a fixed size, just like the variable in Java is a fixed size. What that means is that when I store this integer into the file, I am only going to use a maximum of 10 characters. My account number cannot go beyond 10 characters. So if you think of a student number, if you're a student, everybody has a student number, that could be a fixed length. And I'm going to use 10 for this, and my last name is not going to go beyond 12 characters, and my first name can't go beyond 10, and my balance is going to be fixed to 10 as well, and the date, well, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, let's say 10 again. This is really nice because what it means is that I can figure out which piece of data I'm accessing just by knowing how many characters to go through. So if I want to find the balance, I can just jump through 32 characters to get over to here and see my balance right away. And so you can imagine in Java how you could just say, skip 32 characters, read the balance. And you also can do that for all of the other records that you might have. Because everything is a fixed length, you know how many characters you need to skip to get to any particular point. It becomes math. And math is something we can all do. And so this type of file would be a fixed length. And that's really nice to have, but it's not always practical, and it sometimes gets us into trouble. So if I have a fixed length field and my bank balance gets too big, or you need more account numbers, or if you have a long last name like mine, sometimes when I go to register for things, it won't take my full last name, and I have to kind of, destroy it somehow in order to fit it in. And that's a real problem sometimes for fixed length fields. One of the most famous situations, and it's not quite the same, but Y2K is a perfect example. Massive paranoia among companies, worried that once they were using 2 digits to represent a year, and they were worried that after 99 a lot of the programs would break because the programs were relying on a fixed length of 2 characters to represent the year, and after that it would roll back to 00, which may break a bunch of programs. Or just think if it's doing less thans or greater thans, you've completely messed up the logic. And that would be an example of a problem with fixed length fields. The other possible way of doing it is with something called delimited. Okay, delimited information. And so when you have delimited information, you are not going to try to control the length of this. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to use some sort of a special key combination to determine when one ends and the next field begins. You are going to use some sort of identifier in order to determine that. And that identifier is called a delimiter. The most common delimiter is called comma, the comma delimited files, and Excel is really good at doing that. And I'll show you what a comma delimited file would look like. So let's come back over here and let me show you what this information would look like. This is my account number. This would be my last name. This would be my first name, my balance, and the date. And so when you look at this now, it's all together in one big long string, but I know that the space between one and the other based on this delimiter. Sometimes you can have all of this on just one line, but more often than not, you'll have another line in the file to denote the next record, and the next record could have the same sort of information in it, and so on and so forth. And so now this field can grow as big as it needs to. You have an unlimited, potentially unlimited amount of growth for the size of each field. Unfortunately, delimited information has its own problems. And it doesn't have to be commas. You can use other things to delimit it, but the issue becomes, what happens if I want to use a comma inside my my fields? Like, let's say for some crazy reason my last name is actually R, D. Well, you can't do it, right? But you have to do it because you may need to, you can't hardly think of a delimiter that might not be possible to use inside a field. And so this becomes a bit of an issue, and there are ways around it, and I'm going to leave that as a thinking exercise to you. But I mean, perhaps you need to try to create a unique combination of keys, but that could backfire too. So you need to try to think of some way around that. And Java has solved, Java has not solved, but Java has also had to address this type of situation. But that's the only hint I'm gonna give you on that one. So one of the things that in my course that you're expected to do is you are expected to know how to write information in a delimited format. Fixed length we get to if we talk about binary files. Fixed length becomes really kind of interesting to play around with. But right now we're looking at delimited information. Now, how do you do something like this? Like practically in Java. I mean, hopefully you can see why it's useful. If I had a class to represent an account and I had an array of those accounts, I could very easily go through that array and save the information to a file, and I could very easily read it in again, create an account object for each of these, and load the information into my program. So hopefully you can see why it's useful. How do you create it? And it turns out that it's actually not too difficult to do. You know most of it already. You just might not know that you know it. So the way I'm going to demonstrate this is not by thinking about files at all, just thinking about strings. So let's look at writing to a file. In order to write to a file, I'm trying to create a string that is delimited. And so the first thing that I should do is I should determine what my delimiter is. So let me create a string, and we're going to call it delimiter. And in this case, I'm going to make it a comma delimited file that I wish to write. Age and name, let's say this is the information that I actually want to write out to the file. So how can I build a string that will represent the information that I want? Just to make things a little more interesting, let's add one more field in here. There we go. So the way that you do it is literally by assembling the string with concatenation using the delimiter. So I could say this is going to the file, and going to the file I would like to have my name first, then I want to have the delimiter, then I want to have my age, then the delimiter, then I want to have the boolean true, and that's it. You don't usually end with the delimiter. The delimiter separates your information. Because we're putting a new record on each line, we don't need to have a delimiter after this piece here. So there you go. And let's just, instead of writing to a file, let's just write it to the screen, run our program, and there you go, comma delimited in whatever fashion you want. Now, reading from a file, so let's imagine that I've read a line from my file, and this is what I have read in, and somehow I want to get into or access to the individual information. Well, it turns out this is pretty easy as well, but it could take a little bit of extra work after you split things up. So let me show you what I mean. There is actually a command associated with strings called split. And so, for example, I could say string. Notice I'm creating an array here. and you're going to see that what split expects is a string. Now you're going to notice here it talks about regular expressions. Regular expressions are beyond the scope of the course that we're doing, but any good programmer should spend some time understanding what they are. They're pretty important for a lot of things in programming, but also just kind of in life sometimes when you're trying to do Google searches even. But all that matters for us is that I can put a string in here and it will split based on that string. So for example, if I put in delimiter, because we know that I've set my delimiter to be a comma, and it is a good policy to use a string like this because this will allow you to change your delimiter if you need to. But now what it's going to do is it's going to split that into individual fields. It's going to return it as an array, but it's going to return it as an array of strings. And that may mean that you have a bit of extra work. So I do like to prove to you that things work. So let's just take this here and let's print this array out to the screen so you can see what it looks like. So arrays.toString, let's throw in our fields, run the program, and what we should see here now is that it is indeed split into 4 different pieces. And you'll see even when the arrays wants to show me what's in an array, it actually delimits itself with commas. These commas have nothing to do with what's here. Instead, it's just the way that this this toString is choosing to display the array. So the question you might have then becomes, this is a number. I want it to be a number. And right now it's representing everything as a string. Well, if you haven't encountered this yet, and I know many of you have, you can very easily in Java turn strings into other data types. So to give you an example, I'm going to take an integer, I am going to create it to say age, and that's going to be equal to, integer dot. And now I can see all this stuff here. What I actually want to do is I want to parse an integer. So parse means it's going to take this string and try its very best to turn it into an integer. Look, do you see this over here? We just talked about exceptions. Exceptions show up all the time in Java, not just with files. It's just normally we ignore them and they break our program. So let's just finish this off here. And I want to put in fields at 0. So even though when I do this, oh, I already defined it, darn it, there we go. It's not going to it's not going to show any errors here. There is a possibility that this is going to throw an exception. And so I could, if I wanted, put a try block around here and catch that exception and handle it gracefully. It's just Java's not going to enforce it on us. And so there you go. I can easily take this, and Java is going to do its best to turn this into a number if it can. Otherwise, it will throw an error, an exception at us. And guess what? That's it. It is as easy as that. So remember, just as a quick overview, when we want to save text, we can just send it out like an essay, or we can save text that's formatted. And that becomes super useful when you have data, which is most of the time, that is in sort of a tabular format. And so then you can either save it as fixed fields, which has certain advantages and disadvantages, or as delimited information, which has certain advantages and disadvantages. And what we focused on today is being able to do delimited information. I did mention that when you save things to a file, you could just save it as a big long string like this. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the print line when we're writing to a file so that every line will have one record to it. And that just makes things a little bit easier. Both of these techniques that I gave you are actually not the only way to do this. You could actually change the scanner to read in a delimited fashion, so that next will actually read in by the commas, but it turns out that that's a little bit trickier to do than following this technique that we're doing. So I hope that this answered some of your questions. If you're following along in the grade 12 course, this is exactly the technique that you're going to want to use for login information. You're going to want to take the information that someone puts in to register. You're going to want to have a class in your program to represent a user, and then you're going to want to be able to save that information to a file in a delimited format. Hope this was helpful. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.